Why did no one bother to ask her name when she stepped off the transport just before dawn? The desert air was cold enough to sting, the kind that crept under layers and reminded you how small you were before the day even began. She adjusted the strap of her duffel once and waited as the gate slid open without ceremony. No escort, no salutes, no questions, just a glance from a board guard and a gesture to move along. Camp sentinels swallowed people like her every week, observers, analysts, liaisons who came and went without leaving a footprint. She looked exactly like that kind of person, intentional, ordinary, forgettable. Inside the compound, the day was already loud. Boots on gravel, voices cutting through the air, the low metallic clatter of gear being dropped and lifted again. She walked through it without interrupting the rhythm, staying just outside the current. A clipboard tucked under her arm, eyes forward, shoulders relaxed but aligned. It was the posture of someone who had learned long ago how to disappear without becoming small. She heard the comments before she saw the men who made them. Another observer, probably here to write a report no one reads. Clipboard civilian. None of it landed like an insult. It landed like confirmation. This was exactly what she'd expected. She didn't correct them, didn't glance back. She had learned that the fastest way to lose access was to announce yourself too early. Power didn't like being surprised. It liked thinking it was alone. At the morning briefing, she stood against the canvas wall while Alpha Team filled the center space. The men were confident in the way only people who'd survived too much could be. Loud, loose, untouchable. She recognized the cadence instantly, humor sharpened into armor, cruelty masked as efficiency. She wrote nothing down at first. She just watched. There was one voice that set the tone. Chief Kyle Brenner didn't need to raise it. People leaned toward it automatically. He spoke like the room belonged to him, like the rules bent in his presence. Decorated, experienced, dangerous in ways that didn't show up on after-action reports. When he joked, people laughed a half-second too fast. When he criticized, no one pushed back. Authority like that didn't come from rank alone. It came from fear and admiration twisted together until you couldn't tell which one you were feeling. He noticed her eventually, not fully, just enough to dismiss her. "She's probably tallying our microaggressions," he said once, not even looking at her. Laughter rippled. She flipped a page on her clipboard. Inside, something tightened. Not anger, not yet. Recognition. She'd seen this pattern before in places that prided themselves on toughness and called it character. She stayed silent because silence gave her something noise never could: time. By the second day, she felt the shift. It always happened when someone realized they couldn't provoke a reaction. Dismissal turned into irritation. Irritation sharpened into intent. Brenner found reasons to single her out that were technically permissible. Extra tasks, awkward questions, little tests meant to remind everyone watching that she was outside the circle. When he joked about her gear, she answered once. Calm, factual, no apology. It unsettled him. From that moment on, the tone changed. Not loudly, subtly, like pressure building in a sealed room. He timed her runs aloud, assigned her to labor no one else rotated into, called her ma'am the way some people used to blade, polite on the surface, meant to cut underneath. She carried it all without comment. Each slight pressed against something deeper than pride. She wasn't thinking about her reputation. She was thinking about the last time she'd stood in a place like this and watched someone else get broken because no one wanted to challenge the person in charge. She had promised herself then that she would never forget what silence cost. At night, when the base quieted and the wind moved through the fencing, she stood alone and watched patterns emerge. Who laughed, who looked away, who hesitated, who obeyed even when their hands shook. She wasn't waiting for revenge. She was waiting for truth. And truth, she knew, always arrived when power went too far. It happened in the heat of the afternoon, when fatigue made tempers brittle and rules easier to bend. She was working near the refueling depot when Brenner approached. His shadow fell across her boots before his voice reached her ears. He circled slowly, eyes scanning her like he was looking for something wrong. When he commented on her hair, she corrected him, once, professionally, within regulation. That was all it took. Something hardened in his expression. The easy confidence slipped, replaced by something smaller and more dangerous. Control, threatened, doesn't shout, it tests how far it can go. When he ordered 2 men to restrain her, time slowed in the way it only does when something irreversible is about to happen. She saw the hesitation in their faces, the fear, the calculation. They obeyed anyway, not because they wanted to, because obedience had been conditioned into them as survival. She didn't resist. The clippers buzzed to life. The sound cut through the compound sharper than any command. Hair fell in uneven clumps, dark against the dust. She focused on her breathing, on staying upright, on not giving him the reaction he wanted. Humiliation only worked if you accepted it. When it was over, the silence was worse than the noise. No one moved. No one spoke. Lines had been crossed so clearly that even denial felt impossible. She looked at him once and spoke quietly, evenly, without drama. "You just ended your career." It wasn't a threat, it was a statement. She walked away alone, scalp burning in the open air, every step measured. Inside the logistics trailer, she closed the door and gave herself half a minute to feel everything she'd refused to show. Then she reached into her clipboard case and activated a device few people alive had ever seen. Her report was brief, precise, factual. By morning, the compound felt different, not louder, quieter, tighter, like a held breath. Unmarked vehicles arrived without announcement. Rules long ignored suddenly mattered. Cameras were checked. Names were verified. Brenner noticed the shift but couldn't place it. He spoke less, smiled too much. Power always sensed when it was being watched, even if it didn't know by whom. She returned to formation with her head uncovered. No apology, no explanation, just presence. It unsettled them more than anger ever could. Some avoided her eyes, others couldn't stop looking. When the senior officer arrived late that afternoon, conversation died mid-sentence. A woman stepped out of the vehicle. No name tape, no introduction, just a bearing that pulled gravity toward her. People straightened without being told. Brenner went still. The officer didn't address the group at first. She looked at the woman with the shaved head and nodded once. "General," she said quietly, "walk with me." The word rippled through the compound like a shockwave. They walked without speaking, past places the general had memorized years ago when this base was still an idea on paper. The admiral finally broke the silence, her voice carrying something close to regret. "They never answered your messages," she said. "No," the general replied. "They answered in other ways." The admiral stopped walking, looked at her fully now. "You didn't need to prove anything." "I wasn't proving," the general said. "I was confirming." Behind them, Camp Sentinel waited. By morning, instructors would be gone, records corrected, policies rewritten. Not loudly, not publicly. Accountability rarely needed spectacle to be permanent. The next day, she crossed the yard in full uniform, insignia restored. No one spoke. No one mocked. They didn't salute. They stood straighter. One by one, others moved to stand beside her, not because they were ordered to, because they finally understood what rank really meant. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. Sometimes strength doesn't announce itself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak at all. It simply stands and lets the truth catch up. Why did the silence feel heavier the morning after, as if the base itself knew something irreversible had happened? She woke before the horn, before boots scraped gravel and voices rehearsed toughness they didn't feel anymore. For a moment she lay still, eyes open, staring at the low ceiling of the temporary quarters. The air smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. Her scalp prickled where hair had been, every exposed inch reminding her of yesterday, not as pain but as memory. Pain faded. Memory didn't. Memory stayed sharp so it could teach. She sat up slowly, letting the day come to her instead of chasing it. The mirror on the locker door caught her reflection and held it there. No cover, no attempt to hide. The unevenness was obvious, jagged in places where the clippers had bitten without care. She studied it without flinching, not with pride, not with shame, with inventory. This was what had been taken. This was what remained. Outside, the compound was already awake, but the noise was wrong, too controlled, like people were afraid of what might spill out if they spoke freely. She stepped into the yard and felt eyes move toward her, then away, then back again. Curiosity braided with guilt made a strange gravity. The men who had laughed the loudest yesterday now found reasons to check their laces. The ones who had said nothing looked the most uncertain of all. She took her place where she had always stood, against the edge, present but not central. The position told her everything she needed to know about how the base thought of observers, visible enough to blame, distant enough to ignore. Only now the distance felt artificial, like a rule no one remembered how to enforce. Brenner wasn't there yet. The absence was noticed. It always was when someone like him didn't take up space. People shifted, whispering just under breath. A rumor didn't need words, it only needed tension. She felt it ripple outward, touching everyone differently. For some it was relief, for others fear, for a few anger, at him, at themselves, at her, though she had done nothing but exist. When he finally arrived, it was quieter than she'd ever seen him. No jokes, no swagger. He moved like a man trying not to make waves in deep water. He didn't look at her. That alone was an admission. Power, when unchallenged, stared directly. When cornered, it avoided mirrors. They ran drills. On paper, it was a normal training day. In practice, it felt like a performance no one believed in anymore. Commands were by the book, corrections delivered without bite. The cruelty that had once passed for motivation had evaporated overnight, replaced by a stiff politeness that rang false. She watched it all, pen moving now, not because she needed notes, but because the act of writing gave her cover to observe without being obvious. Inside her chest, a different tension lived. Not satisfaction, not relief, something heavier. She had known this moment would come, and still, part of her wished it hadn't had to arrive this way. She thought of the younger version of herself, years ago, hair cropped regulation short, heart full of belief that competence alone would be enough. She remembered the first time someone had tested that belief, and how long it had taken to understand that silence, too, could be a weapon. A junior operator stumbled during a timed movement drill. Not badly, just enough to draw attention. Yesterday, it would have earned him a verbal flaying. Today, Brenner corrected him evenly and moved on. The operator looked almost disappointed, like he'd braced for pain that never came. Growth didn't always feel like progress. Sometimes it felt like the loss of something familiar, even if that thing had been harmful. During a water break, Rodriguez drifted closer. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, helmet tucked under his arm, eyes fixed on the ground. "I should have stopped it," he said finally. She took a sip from her canteen, let the silence stretch just long enough for his words to settle. "Yes," she replied, not harsh, not kind, honest. He swallowed. "I didn't know what would happen if I didn't." "I know," she said. "That's why systems fail. They teach people that consequences are worse for disobedience than for cruelty." He nodded, jaw tight. There was no absolution in her tone, but there wasn't condemnation either. Accountability wasn't about punishment. It was about clarity. He stepped back into line with something heavier on his shoulders than his pack. By midday, the heat pressed down hard. Sweat traced paths along spines and temples. The base felt smaller under it, like walls closing in. That was when the vehicles came. No sirens, no announcements, just engines cutting through the afternoon like a blade. She felt it before she saw them. A change in posture, heads turning in unison, the sound of gravel under unfamiliar tires. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The ripple reached her anyway. 3 dark vehicles rolled to a stop near the admin area. Doors opened. People stepped out who didn't belong to the daily rhythm of Camp Sentinel. Their uniforms were plain, their movements efficient. They didn't scan the area like tourists. They assessed it like surgeons. Brenner noticed then. She saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the way his hand flexed at his side as if reaching for authority that no longer answered. He looked around, searching for cues for someone to take charge. No one did. Orders came quietly. Names were called, not shouted, not dramatized, simply spoken and obeyed. One by one, instructors were asked to step aside. The separation was subtle but unmistakable, a line drawn without chalk. She was asked to wait. It was the longest hour of her life. Not because she feared the outcome. She had already accepted it, but because waiting meant remembering. The holding space between action and consequence always did. She thought of every report she'd written over the years that had disappeared into systems designed to absorb impact without changing shape. She thought of the women who had come after her, some of them brilliant, some barely holding on, all of them told in different ways to endure quietly if they wanted to stay. She wondered how many would walk through these gates in the future and feel something different because of what happened here. The thought steadied her. When the senior officer finally approached her, the noise of the base seemed to recede, as if respect itself had weight. The woman's eyes flicked briefly to her scalp, then back to her face. No pity, just recognition. "General," she said, "we'll need your statement." The word landed differently this time, not as revelation, as restoration. They spoke privately, facts laid out cleanly, timelines confirmed, no embellishment, no emotional appeals. She resisted the urge to soften anything. Truth didn't need cushioning. The officer listened without interruption, nodding only when necessary. When it was done, she closed the folder and exhaled once. "This will take time," she said, "but it will be thorough." "I know," the general replied. As the sun dipped lower, the compound changed again. The loud certainty of the morning had been replaced by something quieter and more honest. People didn't know where to stand anymore, so they stood carefully. The absence of unchecked power left a vacuum, and vacuums forced reflection. She walked the perimeter alone as evening settled in. The wind cooled her scalp, gentle now. Somewhere behind her, laughter tried to restart and failed. Growth was awkward like that, necessary, uncomfortable. She paused near the fence and looked back at the base. It looked the same as it had when she arrived. Same structures, same dust, same flags, but she knew better. Places remembered what happened in them, even when people pretended not to. Tomorrow she would still be here, not as a symbol, not as a spectacle, as a presence, watching, measuring, ensuring that what had been exposed didn't quietly stitch itself back together. She rested her hand briefly against the cool metal of the fence and breathed. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment everyone realized there would be no going back. What happens when the fear that once held a place together disappears, and no one knows what replaces it? The third day didn't begin with a horn or shouted orders. It began with hesitation. Men woke and lay still a few seconds longer than usual, listening for the familiar sound of Brenner's voice cutting through the air, telling them who they were supposed to be that morning. It never came. Instead, there was only wind moving across the yard, the faint rattle of tent fabric, the low hum of generators. An unfamiliar quiet, the kind that made people aware of their own thoughts. She noticed it immediately. By the time she stepped outside, the sun was already climbing, painting the compound in harsh gold. The yard filled slowly, unevenly. No one rushed. No one joked. Without the old rhythm, everything felt slightly offbeat, like a march where the drummer had vanished mid-step. She took her usual place. Same posture, same calm. But now people looked at her openly, not with hostility, with searching, as if she might explain what came next simply by standing there. She didn't. That was the hardest part for them to accept. Power that explained itself felt safe. Power that observed silently forced people to confront their own behavior. She had learned long ago that discomfort was often the first sign of growth. A temporary officer ran the morning formation. His voice cracked once when he realized everyone was listening too closely. He corrected himself and continued. Orders were given, drills assigned, everything functional, nothing confident. During movement training, mistakes surfaced that had been hidden for months beneath intimidation and bravado. Timing issues, communication gaps, small lapses that had always been blamed on individual weakness instead of structural rot. Without fear to mask them, the flaws were suddenly obvious. She wrote steadily now. Not notes meant to punish, notes meant to understand. Rodriguez struggled during a coordination drill. Not physically, mentally. He second-guessed every move, glancing toward instructors as if waiting for correction that never came. When the drill ended, he sat on his heels, breathing hard, staring at the dirt like it had answers. She approached him quietly. "You're anticipating failure," she said. He looked up, startled. "I don't know what you want me to do." "I'm not the one you need to listen to," she replied. "You are." The words unsettled him more than any insult ever had. Responsibility did that. He nodded slowly, as if accepting a weight he'd never been allowed to carry before. Around them, others were having similar reckonings. Without someone telling them who to be, they had to decide for themselves. Some rose to it, some struggled. A few resented her for it, though they couldn't have explained why. Resentment often hid behind confusion. By midday, a quiet divide had formed. Those who leaned into the change and those who longed for the certainty of the old cruelty. She watched both groups carefully. Culture shifts weren't loud. They happened in small decisions. Who spoke up? Who stayed silent? Who corrected a mistake gently instead of humiliatingly? During a weapons maintenance session, a junior recruit dropped a component, hands slick with sweat. The old reflex, the sharp rebuke, the public shamming hovered in the air, almost automatic. Then nothing happened. The recruit froze, waiting. An instructor cleared his throat. "Pick it up," he said evenly. "Check it for damage, learn." The recruit nodded, relief and confusion crossing his face at the same time. She felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly. That afternoon, she was called into the admin tent again. This time not for testimony, for discussion. The senior officer sat across from her, jacket off now, sleeves rolled. Less formality, more gravity. "This place relied too heavily on one man," the officer said. "We're seeing how deep that went." "Yes," the general replied. "Charisma fills gaps until it becomes the structure." The officer studied her. "You could take command here, temporarily, stabilize things." The offer wasn't tempting. It was familiar. She'd been asked to clean up broken systems her entire career, to step in where damage had already been done and make it survivable for the next group. She shook her head. "They need to learn how to function without a figurehead. If I step in, I become another one." A pause, then a nod. "You're asking for patience." "I'm asking for ownership." Outside, the heat pressed in again, but the base felt different under it. Less sharp, more exposed. People talked in lower voices now, conversations longer, less performative. For the first time since she'd arrived, she saw someone apologize without being ordered to. Later, as the sun dipped and shadows stretched, she noticed Foster standing alone near the obstacle pits. Arms crossed, jaw tight. The woman had been quiet all week, carrying her own burden of being the only other female presence in a space that made no room for softness. She approached and stopped beside her without comment. "I didn't stop him," Foster said suddenly. "I thought if I did, it would get worse." "Yes," the general said softly. "That doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed. Foster swallowed. "I don't know how to fix that." "You don't fix it," the general replied. "You remember it, and next time you move sooner." They stood there as the light faded, two women shaped by the same system in different ways. One hardened by decades of fighting it. the other just beginning to understand its cost. That night the general didn't sleep much. She lay awake, listening to the base breathe differently now. No shouted laughter, no late-night bravado, just the sounds of people thinking. She thought, too, about the line between endurance and acceptance, about how easily strength could be mistaken for silence, about how many times she had told herself that surviving was the same as changing something. In the early hours, she rose and walked the yard alone. The sky was pale, undecided. She stopped where the hair had fallen days before. Most of it had been swept away, but a few strands still clung to the edges of the ground, stubborn. She knelt and brushed them aside with her fingers. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. It never really had been. It was about exposure, about revealing what happened when authority went unexamined and loyalty went unquestioned. By the time the base stirred again, she was already back in position. Same place, same posture, but the eyes that found her now held something new. Not fear, awareness. And awareness, she knew, was the most dangerous thing of all, for those who had relied on darkness to stay powerful. What happens after the shock wears off, when accountability stops being abstract and starts knocking on individual doors? The fourth day arrived with paperwork. Not the kind people joked about, not the routine forms everyone signed without reading. This was different. This was the slow, grinding machinery of consequence beginning to turn, audible not in noise but in pauses, in meetings that ran long, in doors that stayed closed, in names spoken carefully as if they might fracture the air if handled too roughly. She felt it the moment she stepped into the admin corridor. The walls were the same dull color, the lighting unchanged, but the energy had shifted. People walked with purpose now, not swagger. Every movement seemed measured, as though the base itself had learned restraint. She nodded to a junior officer she'd passed a dozen times before. He nodded back once, sharp, respectful. No smile, no fear, just recognition. She didn't stop. Inside the briefing room, a long table had been cleared of everything except folders and water. No weapons, no gear. That alone said more than any order. This wasn't about performance. It was about decisions. The senior officer was already there, seated but not relaxed. Two others stood near the wall, observers with neutral expressions and careful posture. No one rushed to speak when she entered. They waited until she took a seat. That mattered. "We've begun formal review," the officer said finally. "Statements, logs, footage." She nodded. "You'll find inconsistencies." "Yes," the officer agreed, "not where we expected them." That was the thing about truth. It didn't always align with narrative. People lied in predictable ways, but patterns betrayed them. Silence here, overstatement there. The story told with confidence wasn't always the one supported by evidence. Brenner's name hadn't been spoken yet. She didn't ask about him. She didn't need to. The absence of his name was its own indicator. People like him didn't disappear quietly. When they went still, it meant pressure had finally reached something vital. "Some of the men are struggling," the officer continued, "without him." She met the officer's gaze. They were struggling with him too, they just didn't know it. A pause, then a nod. "You're staying on as planned." "Yes. Even now. Especially now." Outside, the day unfolded slowly. Training continued, but it looked different. Less bark, more conversation. Mistakes were addressed, not exploited. The yard felt raw, like skin after a burn, sensitive, vulnerable, capable of healing if treated carefully. Not everyone welcomed it. A small group gathered near the equipment shed during a break. Low voices, tight expressions. She didn't need to hear the words to recognize the tone. Loss often masqueraded as anger when people didn't know where else to put it. For some of them, Brenner hadn't just been a leader. He'd been a shield. Someone to absorb responsibility so they wouldn't have to. She walked past them without slowing. One of them muttered something under his breath, not loud enough to challenge, loud enough to test. She stopped, turned, looked at him fully. "What is it?" she asked. The question was simple, calm. It left him nowhere to hide. He flushed, jaw working as if deciding whether defiance or retreat was safer. Finally, he shook his head. "Nothing, ma'am." She held his gaze a second longer, then nodded once and moved on. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt weight. Leadership, real leadership, always came with it, not the weight of command, the weight of impact. Every word, every pause, every decision rippled outward. She carried that awareness like a pack she couldn't set down. That afternoon, she was asked to review training footage with a mixed group of instructors. Not to judge, to observe. The irony wasn't lost on her. They sat in a darkened room, eyes fixed on a screen replaying drills from earlier in the week. Moments she had witnessed firsthand now flattened into pixels. The insults were quieter on video. The power plays subtler. Cruelty rarely looked dramatic when stripped of context. That was how it survived scrutiny. She paused the footage once. "Watch their faces," she said softly. The room leaned in. On screen, a recruit absorbed a verbal correction, shoulders stiffening, eyes lowering, not defiance, shut down. "That's not resilience," she continued. "That's compliance." No one argued. As the session ended, one instructor lingered behind. Older, weathered, the kind of man who'd seen cycles come and go and learned when to speak carefully. "I didn't think it was that bad," he said quietly. She met his eyes. "That doesn't make you cruel." "No," he agreed, "just inattentive." He nodded to himself, as if filing the thought away for later. Growth often started like that, not with apology but with recognition. As evening approached, the base prepared for a change few spoke about openly. Brenner's quarters were being cleared, not ceremonially, efficiently, his gear inventoried, his space emptied of personal markers. It was astonishing how quickly someone could vanish once the institution decided to let go. She stood at a distance, watching men carry boxes without comment. No one joked. No one lingered. It felt less like punishment and more like erasure. She wondered if that was harder, to be removed without spectacle, to become a lesson rather than a villain. Rodriguez approached her again as dusk settled. He looked exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. "They're saying he won't be back," he said. She nodded. "I don't know how to feel," he admitted. "Part of me is relieved. Part of me feels like I failed him." "You didn't fail him," she replied. "You failed yourself when you stopped trusting your own judgment. That's something you can correct." He absorbed that slowly. "Will it always feel like this?" "No," she said. "It will feel worse before it feels better. Then it will feel like responsibility." That night she sat alone outside the barracks, back against the cool concrete, looking up at a sky crowded with stars. The desert offered no softness, but it offered clarity. Distance made patterns visible. She thought about the cost of anonymity, the protection it offered, and the harm it allowed. She thought about the irony of her rank, hidden so carefully it had nearly cost her dignity. She didn't regret it. Exposure had done what authority alone never could. It had forced the system to confront itself without excuses. In the early hours, she was called once more to the admin building. This time, the atmosphere was final. "Chief Brenner has been relieved," the officer said, "pending tribunal." She closed her eyes briefly, not in triumph, in acknowledgement. "There will be backlash," the officer continued. "Quiet, internal, but it will come." "I know," the general replied. "Change always collects a debt." The officer studied her. "You're willing to stay." She opened her eyes. "I already am." When dawn came, it found a base still learning how to stand without leaning on fear. Some adjusted quickly. Others struggled. A few resisted. But none could pretend anymore that nothing had happened. She walked the yard one more time before the day's drills began. boots steady, head bare, eyes forward. She wasn't there to inspire, she wasn't there to intimidate. She was there to remind them, simply by existing, that strength didn't require cruelty, and authority didn't require humiliation. Sometimes the hardest thing a system could face wasn't an enemy from the outside. It was the quiet presence of someone who refused to look away. What do you do when the system finally listens, and you're no longer sure you want it to? The fifth day began with a request she hadn't expected. It came quietly, delivered by a young lieutenant who looked like he'd rehearsed the sentence in his head a dozen times before speaking it out loud. No rank games, no bravado, just uncertainty wrapped in professionalism. "They'd like you to address the cadre," he said. "Not formally, just talk to them." She didn't answer right away. This was the moment most people imagined when they talked about change, the speech, the clarity, the turning point wrapped neatly in words. But she knew better. Words could point, they couldn't carry, and once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. "I'll listen first," she said. The lieutenant nodded, relieved he hadn't been asked to persuade her. The room they gathered in was smaller than the main briefing tent, close enough that no one could hide in the back. Chairs scraped softly as instructors settled, posture careful, expressions guarded. Some of them had avoided her all week. Others watched her like they were waiting for instructions they didn't trust themselves to give. She stood when she entered, but she didn't take the front. She chose a spot near the center, same level, same floor. For a long moment no one spoke. The silence wasn't tense, it was expectant, the kind that asked who would move first. An instructor finally cleared his throat. "We didn't think it would go that far." She nodded. "Most people don't." Another voice followed. "He wasn't always like that." "No one is," she replied. The room shifted slightly. Shoulders loosened. Not because they felt absolved, but because she wasn't attacking. She wasn't there to shame them into submission. Shame only taught people to hide better. "What happens now?" someone asked. She took a breath, not for drama, but to choose accuracy over comfort. "Now," she said, "you decide who you are without him." A murmur moved through the group. "You don't need another Brenner. You don't need a replacement voice to tell you when to speak or when to look away. You already know what crossed the line. The question is whether you'll act on that knowledge next time, or wait for someone else to do it for you." No raised voices, no applause, just stillness. "That's it?" one man asked, almost disappointed. She met his eyes. "That's everything." After the meeting, she walked the grounds alone. The base looked unchanged to an outsider, but she could feel the difference under her boots. The way people corrected each other now, quieter, quicker, without spectacle. The way jokes died before they sharpened into something else. The way eyes lingered when someone hesitated, not to mock, but to check. Change was fragile at this stage. It could harden into culture or snap back into habit. Both paths looked the same from a distance. She passed the obstacle course and saw something small, almost unremarkable. A recruit had fallen during a wall climb, not badly, just enough to stall. Another stepped in without being ordered, offered a shoulder, steadying him. No comments, no laughter, they moved on together. She stopped walking. That hadn't been taught, not yet, it had emerged. Later that afternoon, she was asked if she planned to reveal herself officially, to speak as who she was, not as who they had assumed. The question followed her longer than the words. That evening, as the light thinned and the desert cooled, she sat at the edge of the training yard and finally allowed herself to feel tired. Not physically. That exhaustion had become familiar long ago. This was deeper, the kind that came from holding steady while everyone else recalibrated around you. She thought about the cost of being seen. Visibility protected you, but it also erased the quiet truths anonymity exposed. When people knew who you were, they behaved differently. Better sometimes, worse in others, but rarely honestly. She touched her scalp absently. Hair would grow back. That wasn't the point. What had been stripped wasn't hair. It was assumption. An assumption once removed didn't regrow so easily. Rodriguez joined her without asking, sat a few feet away, said nothing at first. "I keep replaying it," he said eventually. "The moment I didn't let go." She didn't answer right away. "You're not the only one," she said finally, "but you're one of the few who noticed." He nodded, staring out at the yard. "Do you ever get used to carrying that?" "No," she said. "You just learn not to drop it on other people." As darkness settled, a quiet resolve moved through the base. Not unified, not perfect, but real. She could feel it in the absence of noise, in the way people lingered in conversation instead of dispersing quickly, in the way mistakes were addressed without theater. Before turning in, she drafted a short message to command. Not a report, a recommendation. No public announcement. No symbolic gestures. No speeches about progress. Just time, oversight, and accountability that didn't need witnesses to function. She sent it and powered the device down. Tomorrow would be her last full day here. The thought surprised her with a flicker of something like reluctance. Not because she wanted to stay, but because leaving meant trusting the change to survive without her. That night sleep came unevenly. She dreamed of past bases, past faces, past moments where she had chosen silence because the cost of speaking felt too high. She woke before dawn with the weight of those memories pressing close, then let them go. When she stepped outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten. The bay stirred slowly, thoughtfully, no rush, no barking. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, breathing in the quiet. Change didn't announce itself with certainty. It asked to be trusted, and then tested that trust when no one was watching. What stays behind when the person who forced the change finally walks away? The last morning didn't feel like an ending. That was what unsettled her most. She woke before the light again, but this time there was no urgency in it. No weight pulling her upright, just awareness. The quiet hum of a place that had learned, at least for now, how to breathe without being shouted into motion. She dressed slowly, deliberately, full uniform, insignia in place, no cover on her head, not as a statement anymore, just habit, identity reclaimed without ceremony. When she stepped outside, the air was cool and clear, the desert sky stretched wide and undecided. Camp Sentinel looked the same as it always had, but she knew better. She had learned long ago that places remembered what people tried to forget. Walls absorbed tone. Yards remembered footsteps. Silence stored echoes. The yard filled gradually, not rushed, not dragged. People arrived with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. No one needed to be yelled at to take their place. That alone told her more than any formal report ever could. She took her position where she'd always stood. No one told her to move. That mattered. The temporary officer called the formation to order. His voice was firm now, still careful but no longer brittle. He ran through the morning tasks without embellishment, without cruelty disguised as motivation. When he finished, he hesitated, just a fraction longer than protocol required. Then he nodded to her. She hadn't asked for that, she hadn't needed it. But acknowledgement, freely given, carried its own weight. Training moved smoothly, not flawlessly, smoothly. Corrections were made, questions asked. For the first time since her arrival, she saw people speak up without looking over their shoulders first. It was subtle, fragile, but real. Mid-morning, she was called into the admin building one last time. The senior officer stood when she entered. "Your recommendations have been accepted," she said. "Oversight remains in place. Rotations adjusted. This base will be watched for a while." The general nodded. "Good." A pause followed, the kind that carried things unsaid. "They wanted a statement," the officer added. "Public, symbolic." "And?" the general asked. "I told them no," the officer replied. I said if they needed a speech to remember this, then it hadn't worked. Something eased in the general's chest. Not relief, alignment. They spoke briefly about logistics, departure time, transport, no medals, no ceremony. When it was over, the officer extended her hand. "Thank you," she said. The general took it, for listening. When she stepped back into the yard, word had already spread. Not officially. It never needed to. People felt endings the same way they felt beginnings, through shifts in attention, through the way movement slowed around a moment. Rodriguez found her near the water trough. "I heard you're leaving," he said. "Yes." He nodded. "I wanted to say I won't forget." She studied his face. The fatigue was still there, so was something else now. Responsibility, worn awkwardly but honestly. "Don't remember me," she said. "Remember the moment you knew better." He smiled faintly. "That's harder." "Yes," she agreed, "but it lasts longer." Foster approached next, hesitant, stronger than she'd been days ago but still carrying doubt like a bruise. "I stayed," she said, almost defensively, "when it would have been easier to leave." The general nodded. "Then you're already doing more than most." Foster swallowed. "I don't want to be silent anymore." "Then don't be," the general said. "Just be prepared to stand alone sometimes." Foster held her gaze, then straightened. "I think I can." The general believed her. As departure time approached, something unexpected happened. No announcement, no order. One by one, people began to gather along the edge of the yard, not in formation, not in salute, just present, watching, some with hands behind their backs, others with arms crossed, faces unreadable but eyes steady. She stopped walking. For a moment, the world narrowed to breath and ground and space between people. Then she did something she hadn't planned. She turned and faced them. Not as a general, not as a symbol, as a person who had endured and chosen not to harden. "I won't tell you to do better," she said quietly, her voice carried without effort. "You already know when you are." Silence. "I won't ask for apologies. Those are private things." Stillness. "I will ask you to remember what happened here, not as a scandal, not as a story, but as a mirror. When things get difficult, when it's easier to look away, when someone tests how much you'll tolerate." She paused. "That's when rank means something." She nodded once, then turned back toward the gate. No one followed, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The transport waited where it always had, unmarked, ordinary. She stowed her bag, stepped inside, and took one last look through the open door. Camp Sentinel stood quiet behind her. Not healed, not redeemed, but aware. As the vehicle pulled away, dust rose briefly, then settled. The base receded into the landscape, another place among many. But she knew something would remain there long after she was gone. Not her name, not her rank, not her story. A pause, a hesitation, a moment when someone would feel a line approaching and stop. She leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes. The sun warmed her scalp gently now. Hair would grow back. Systems would resist. People would forget parts and remember others imperfectly. That was how change always worked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clean. It didn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it entered a place quietly, endured what it had to, and left behind a question no one could ignore anymore. And sometimes dignity didn't raise its voice. It didn't demand recognition. It didn't ask permission. It simply acted and trusted the truth to finish the work.